Walter Briggs was 78 years old, a solitary figure whose presence lingered like a soft whisper in the countryside of eastern Texas. His small rural home stood quietly, nestled on the edge of the woods, with chipped white paint and a crooked porch swing that creaked with every gust of wind. Time had etched its story on Walter's face. His weathered hands bore the thick, hardened calluses of a man who had spent decades working with purpose, never idling. His eyes carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had seen far more than he'd ever spoken aloud. And wasn't that always the way with men like him, those who had lived through hell and come back, silent and dignified? In Mill Creek County, everyone knew him, though not deeply. To most, he was just Old Man Briggs, a familiar sight who kept to himself. But he was never rude. He'd nod respectfully when someone passed him on the road, offering just enough of a smile to make you feel acknowledged. Yet he was a mystery, a relic, a man with the kind of quiet presence that made you wonder, who had he been before this life of solitude? For nearly 60 years, Walter had driven the same exact truck. Can you imagine that? A 1962 GMC pickup that somehow had survived the test of time. That truck was a rolling time capsule, a dusty blue beast with cracked leather seats and an engine that practically shouted its arrival from half a mile away. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol. The townspeople had grown so used to it that they nicknamed it the war truck, partly because of its battered exterior, partly out of childhood whimsy. The kids loved to guess what kind of battles it had seen, though none of them had any clue how close their guesses came to the truth. Every Tuesday and Friday, like clockwork, Walter would make his slow and steady way through town. He bought only what he needed, nothing more, the same items every time. He paid in exact change, not a penny over or under, and when he spoke, his words were few and chosen carefully. It wasn't that he was unfriendly, far from it. He simply spoke as though words were a resource, something to be conserved like ammunition in the field, or fresh water during a dry season. What kind of life teaches a man to treat words like that? But something was different on this particular Tuesday evening. The sky was painted with twilight's warm hues as the sun dipped behind the trees. And inside his quiet little house, Walter did something unexpected. He broke his pattern. With deliberate care, he wrapped a small object in a soft cloth, folding each corner with a tenderness that spoke volumes. He placed it gently in a hand-carved wooden box, aged and worn but still sturdy. The lock was simple, brass, functional, but the ritual? Oh, it was reverent. His hands trembled slightly now, a recent development brought on by age, yet his grip remained steady enough for the task. Next to the box, he set down a handwritten letter, his cursive script shaking just a bit. The envelope read, Precinct 17 Police Department. Inside, the message was clear. Deliver this to Precinct 17. Don't let anyone else touch it. Then he placed the box and letter on the passenger seat of the war truck, turned the ignition, and let the familiar rumble of the engine fill the evening air. No radio, no one beside him, just the rhythmic hum of that old engine and the weight of a promise that had lived in his heart for nearly half a century. What kind of burden had he carried all these years? 40 miles of open Texas road stretched before him, lit by the last rays of sun and the soft glow of the truck's headlights. But as he neared the county line, he noticed something strange, flashing lights, a security checkpoint. Unusual for such a quiet stretch of road, but not entirely out of the blue, given recent border concerns. A young officer, barely more than a kid, waved him down. License and registration, please, the officer said, shining his flashlight into the cab. Walter moved slowly, deliberately, reaching for a wallet that looked like it had survived a few wars of its own. He handed over a driver's license so worn the photo was barely visible, though still valid. The officer squinted. What brings you out so late, Mr. Briggs? Police business, Walter replied, his voice gravely, like stone grinding against stone. Because it doesn't belong there, Walter said, his voice steady, unwavering. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, measuring the man before him. Then where does it belong? Walter paused, eyes fixed not on the captain, but on something far beyond the confines of the small office. With those who remember, with those who kept the silence, this is closure. Captain Reynolds tapped a pen lightly against his desk. the rhythmic click a counterpoint to the silence that had suddenly deepened between them. Colonel Briggs, if that's really your name, this insignia, this letter, they're not just keepsakes. They're classified history, possibly tied to operations no one wants to talk about. I'm aware, Walter replied. So you understand why I can't just let this go without answers. Walter leaned forward slightly. Captain, I'm not here to stir old ghosts. I came to fulfill a duty that outlived almost everyone who remembered it. The protocol, Silver Line, it was supposed to activate when all known members were confirmed deceased or when the item returned. That's what the letter says. It was never meant to be handed off to just any military office. Reynolds studied the letter again. Echo Shadow. That name doesn't appear in any formal database. No missions, no unit history, nothing. Exactly, Walter said. They were never meant to be remembered by the world, only by each other. A long silence followed. Reynolds finally said, I'll need to make some calls. Higher-ups, quiet ones. Walter nodded. Of course. Outside, the precinct was settling into its graveyard rhythm, but a current of tension lingered in the air. A few officers whispered about the man in holding, how his prince didn't return a criminal history, but something coded with access levels far above standard clearance. Back in the evidence room, Officer Tanner was staring at the insignia again. You ever feel like you're holding something sacred? His partner nodded slowly. Yeah, and I think we're not supposed to be. A few hours later, just past 3 a.m., a black SUV with government plates pulled into the lot. No sirens, no uniforms. 2 men in plain suits entered the building and asked for Captain Reynolds. They spoke in low tones behind closed doors, documents exchanged, a short call made. Reynolds returned to Walter, now sitting in a small holding room. He opened the door and said simply, You're free to go. Walter stood slowly, the years showing now in his stiff joints but not in his eyes. The box? It's already been claimed, Reynolds replied. They said to thank you, and to say, the line held. For a moment, Walter said nothing. Then he offered the captain a nod, a deep, solemn one. That's all I needed to hear. He left the precinct without fanfare, walking out into the cool morning darkness. The sky was just beginning to soften at the edges with the hint of dawn. He got into his truck, lighter now, not just in weight but in burden, and started the engine. There were no reporters, no medals, no names carved in stone, just an old man driving into the sunrise, having kept a promise for nearly half a century. And somewhere behind the veils of memory and silence, those who waited could finally rest. Protocol Silver Line stipulates civilian authority as first contact, Walter said simply. Reynolds leaned in. You could have avoided all this trouble by just telling the checkpoint officers. Walter gave a small, weary smile. Some promises require discretion, Captain, even when it's inconvenient. So who was Colonel Jonathan Briggs, and how was Walter connected? Was it really possible this quiet, mysterious man had spent nearly half a century guarding a symbol of sacrifice, waiting for the day he could finally bring it home? What story had been locked in that box for all these years? And why now, after all this time, did it feel like the past had finally come knocking? Briggs? Captain Reynolds asked, tapping the letter gently, his brow furrowed in thought. Across the desk, Walter's eyes flickered, not just with recognition, but with something deeper, something rooted in years long gone. Was it grief? Was it pride? Maybe it was both. The air between them seemed to hold that moment longer than expected. I've never needed titles to do what's right, Walter replied, his voice calm but layered with unspoken history, the kind of history that weighed heavy on a soul for decades. Just as Reynolds was about to dig deeper, a knock cut through the silence. Officer Tanner stood in the doorway, his urgency unmistakable. Sir, he said, stepping in with a tone that had shifted from routine to alarm, we just ran the insignia through the system. He lowered his voice, eyes scanning the room as if to check who might overhear. It triggered some kind of alert. We've received a priority communication from the Department of Defense. Reynolds straightened. On whose authority? Joint Chiefs level, sir, Tanner answered, his voice tight with tension. The message specifically states, do not handle the box's contents. The individual in custody is a former commanding officer of the Shadow Echo unit. Military representatives are en route. Estimated arrival, 1 hour. The room went still. Not a breath, not a whisper. Joint Chiefs? What in the world had they stumbled into? Walter Briggs, the quiet, solitary man in the worn-out clothes who'd arrived in a battered old pickup truck, was suddenly the subject of national military interest. This wasn't just a misjudged traffic stop anymore. This was something far beyond their small-town precinct's comprehension. Outside in the bullpen, the officers who had once eyed Walter with suspicion now looked at one another with dawning realization. The whispers spread quickly. This wasn't a confused old man anymore. This wasn't a routine impound. The question on everyone's mind was suddenly overwhelming. Who is Walter Briggs, really? Through the office window, Walter could see them all, those curious eyes now filled with something else. Doubt, awe. He didn't flinch. He remained the same composed figure, hands resting gently on his knees, the wooden box sitting between him and the captain like a sacred relic. It wasn't just an object. It was a bridge, a portal to a world they'd never known, a reality only a few had ever touched. "Mr. Briggs," Reynolds said softly now, the respect unmistakable in his tone, "it seems we've made a significant error in how we've handled this situation." But Walter shook his head with a faint, forgiving smile. "You did your job, Captain, and I did mine. Would you like some coffee while we wait?" Reynolds offered, now suddenly aware that he was in the presence of a man who had seen far more than any of them could imagine. "Black, if you have it," Walter answered. "It's been a long drive." As the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere inside the station changed completely. The once routine hum of paperwork and idle chatter had given way to silence, tension, and anticipation. Something monumental was about to happen, and everyone could feel it in their bones. Who among them could say they had ever been part of a moment like this? Then, right at 12 a.m., the station's perimeter sensors came alive. Officers manning the security cameras watched with growing disbelief as 6 black SUVs, all bearing military insignias, pulled into the lot in perfect formation. Not a siren, not a blaring horn, just precision. Discipline, the kind of movement that screamed top-tier military protocol. The vehicles didn't just arrive, they arrived with purpose. In unison, their headlights went dark, and one by one, doors opened. Uniformed personnel stepped out, forming a perimeter around the building like clockwork. Their movements were silent, practiced. This wasn't just a retrieval team. This was something else entirely. A mission. A solemn, precise mission. Inside, chaos teetered on the edge of awe. The young dispatcher tried to make radio contact with the approaching team, only to receive a short, firm reply. "Secure channel established. Stand by for senior officer." "What the hell is this?" muttered one of the rookies. But a veteran sergeant just shook his head, eyes fixed on the screen. "No training I've ever seen. Those are Joint Special Operations insignias. Whatever this is, it's way above our pay grade." Captain Reynolds smoothed down his uniform, bracing himself. He turned to his officers. "Stand at attention. Now." The front doors opened without flourish. No dramatic entrance, just an overwhelming presence. 3 figures entered, 2 military police flanking a tall man in a crisp uniform, chest decorated with ribbons and medals. "General Thomas Harrington, United States Marine Corps," he announced to the stunned desk sergeant, flashing credentials that shimmered with authority. "I understand you're holding Walter Briggs." "Yes, sir," the sergeant managed, blinking rapidly. "Captain Reynolds is with him in his office. The item is secure." "Take me to them immediately." As the general made his way through the station, every officer stood at rigid attention, eyes wide with disbelief. And when he entered Reynolds' office, everything changed. Walter stood, rising with the grace of a man decades younger, and then, astonishing everyone, the general snapped to attention and rendered a formal salute. "Commander Briggs," he said, voice firm and reverent. "It's an honor, sir." Walter returned the salute with precise elegance. "The honor is mine, General, though I haven't been commander in almost 50 years. The silence in that room could have broken hearts. The truth was out. This man, this quiet old soul who had driven alone through the dark Texas night, was no ordinary citizen. He was someone who had once led others into the shadows for the sake of the light. And the world had no idea. "We apologize for the dramatic entrance, Captain," the general continued, "but this matter involves national security protocols established during the Vietnam conflict. May we use your conference room?" "Of course," Reynolds replied, stunned. 20 minutes later, the largest room in the station was transformed. Maps and files were laid out. Recording devices were disabled. The wooden box now sat open, its contents exposed. The insignia that had sparked this extraordinary night. General Harrington addressed the assembled officers. "What I'm about to share is classified, but given the circumstances, you deserve to know." He gestured toward Walter. "This man is Walter Briggs, former commander of Shadow Echo Unit, a team that officially never existed. In 1975, during the fall of Saigon, his unit undertook a classified extraction mission that went catastrophically wrong. He was the only survivor, but he saved 37 lives, even though 11 of his men didn't make it." Gasps echoed softly. "Before evacuation, Commander Briggs recovered this insignia," the general said, holding it gently. "He made a promise to the families of the fallen, to his men, that he would one day return it when secrecy was no longer necessary." "And now," someone whispered. "Now," the general said, "Operation Silver Line has been declassified, just 3 weeks ago. This emblem contains microfilm, documentation of the mission, and the names of those who served." Walter's son, Colonel Jonathan Briggs, continued his father's mission until his death last year. He secured final authorization for this return. Walter's eyes glistened. Jonathan always understood duty. Reynolds looked to his officers, their expressions transformed with awe. "You didn't detain a confused man," the general continued. "You intercepted the final mission of one of the most decorated covert operatives in U.S. history, a man fulfilling a vow that outlived war itself." The young officer who had stopped Walter stepped forward. "Sir, I'm sorry. If I had known—" Walter raised a hand gently. "You did your duty, son. I never fault anyone for that." The general nodded. "This wasn't about recognition. This was about remembrance. We never leave anyone behind, not even in memory." The room stood in silence as it all sank in. Then came the words none of them would ever forget. "Tomorrow, the president will present Commander Briggs with honors on behalf of his unit. We're here to escort him to Andrews Air Force Base." Captain Reynolds stepped forward. "We'd be honored to provide a police escort, sir." Walter smiled. "That won't be necessary, Captain, but there is one thing." "Anything, sir." "I'd like to drive my own truck. It's carried me this far. Seems right it should finish the journey." The general laughed. "That can be arranged, Commander. That old GMC has earned its place in this story, too." And so Walter Briggs, once shadowed by secrecy, now honored by a nation, walked through the station one last time. Officers lined the hallway, standing tall, saluting. The quiet man in the worn coat and boots moved among them with a grace forged in fire and loss. He had lived his life with purpose, carried burdens none of them could imagine, and now, with the world finally watching, he completed one final mission. For honor, for memory, for justice. 1 week later, the story spread like wildfire. Both local and national media outlets couldn't get enough of it. "Oldest truck in county belongs to secret war hero," they declared. "Former Shadow Echo commander honored by military after 47 years. Can you believe it? A man once dismissed as just an old guy in a beat-up pickup had now become a symbol of integrity and forgotten valor." The ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base had been nothing short of breathtaking, both solemn and celebratory, a moment of long overdue justice wrapped in reverence and pride. There he stood, Walter Briggs, but this time, not in his worn clothes or dusty boots. No, Walter was in full military dress uniform, every inch the warrior he had once been, medals glinting across his chest, many of which had been hidden in classified files for decades. Standing beside the President of the United States, Walter held his head high as the names of his fallen comrades were read out loud. For each name, a family member stepped forward, receiving the honors their loved ones had earned with their lives. Many of these families had never met Walter before, yet he had carried each of them in his heart for nearly 50 years. Can you imagine that kind of devotion? That kind of memory? The transformation was nothing less than stunning. The man who had entered that police station in worn denim and a dusty jacket now stood tall, shoulders squared, chin lifted. It was as if the years fell away the moment he put that uniform back on. Even the president listened closely, deferentially, as Walter spoke, not with grandeur, but with quiet, heartfelt reverence, about each of the brave souls who never made it back. And oh, that old truck! Parked behind the ceremonial stage, Walter's beloved GMC pickup. Yes, the very same one he'd driven through rain, sun, and decades of quiet missions sat between two gleaming military vehicles like it had always belonged there. Someone had gone out of their way to polish it up, though Walter insisted the dents and scratches stay. "They're part of the story," he had said. Isn't that just perfect? When Walter stepped up to the podium, you could feel the air still. The audience, military officers, government leaders, families of the fallen, they all waited in hushed respect. "Honor," Walter began, his voice unwavering, "doesn't reside in ribbons or public acclaim. It lives in the promises we keep, even when no one remembers we made them." Those words, so simple, yet so deeply profound, seemed to echo far beyond that stage. Millions watching from home were moved, some to tears. In a world obsessed with recognition, here was a man reminding us that real honor needs no spotlight. After the ceremony, Walter was offered a military transport home, but he kindly declined. Of course he did. He climbed into that old pickup, his steadfast companion, and drove off with a military escort, trailing respectfully behind. Along the highway, people had gathered. On overpasses, roadsides, even in small towns. They waved flags, held signs, and some simply stood in silence, hands over hearts. They didn't know all the details, but they knew they were witnessing something rare, something right. Back in Mill Creek County, the return was nothing short of emotional. The checkpoint where Walter had once been stopped, where officers had eyed him with suspicion, was now lined with uniformed men and women standing at attention. Children who used to laugh at his clunky old truck now looked at it with awe. Those battle scars on the vehicle, they weren't just dents anymore. They were badges of honor. The military even awarded Walter a special commendation for unwavering fidelity to principle in a changing world. But do you know what meant even more to him? A small brass plaque installed on his truck's dashboard. It read, "Walter Briggs, Keeper of Promises for 47 years. How powerful is that? Perhaps the most touching moment came quietly, just days later. No press, no stage, no flags. On a quiet Sunday, the families of the Shadow Echo unit came to Walter's modest home. They brought with them old photographs, handwritten letters, cherished stories. And there in that small living room, they remembered, together. They created a living memorial far more meaningful than any cold statue or marble monument. It was built on shared tears, laughter, and decades of silent remembrance. In the months that followed, Walter's life didn't change much. He still drove that same old truck into town. He still lived in his quiet country home. But something had changed in the way the world looked at him, and maybe even in the way he saw himself. The burden of that long-held promise, it had finally been lifted. You could see it in his eyes, in the way he walked. He had done what he set out to do all those years ago, and the world had finally seen it. A young reporter caught up with him outside the local diner, probably hoping for a headline. "What does it feel like," she asked, "to finally have your story known?" Walter paused, thoughtful. Then, with that same calm clarity, he replied, "Recognition isn't why good men do difficult things. We do them because they're right, whether anyone's watching or not." Then, with nothing more to say, he smiled, tipped his hat, and climbed back into his truck. And just like that, he was gone, driving down the road, a man at peace with his past and proud of his place in history. Have you ever seen someone keep a promise for nearly half a century? It's the kind of story that reminds us that honor doesn't always shout. It whispers. It lives in the quiet acts, the long roads, and the hearts that never forget. So tell us, what moment made you believe that real honor isn't in words, but in silent, steadfast actions? Drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where even the smallest right actions are told, so that honor is never forgotten. Get out of the vehicle. Hands where I can see them. The memory still echoed, the flashlight beam blinding him as he arrived at the police station that fateful night. Midnight, sweat on his brow, a battered old truck, and a simple declaration, "I'm just returning what doesn't belong to me." That was all it took. Moments later, high-pitched alerts rang out. Military SUVs emerged like shadows in the night, silently surrounding the building. No sirens, no bluster, just swift, silent precision. Because what that old man carried wasn't just a box. It was a legacy, a promise, a story the world had nearly forgotten, but now would never let go.